The rain hammered against the windshield as Sarah Mitchell drove through the empty streets of Portland. It was nearly midnight, and the city seemed deserted. She had just finished her shift at the downtown coffee shop, exhausted from serving customers all day. Her hands ached from hours of making lattes and cappuccinos. Nobody in that shop knew her real story. Nobody knew that, just 3 years ago, she had been Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell of the United States Navy, one of the few women to complete the grueling SEAL training program. After 8 years of service, Sarah had retired quietly. The missions had taken their toll, not on her body, but on her soul. She had seen too much, done things she could never speak about, and lost friends she would never forget. When her contract ended, she walked away from military life without looking back. She wanted peace, simplicity, and anonymity. The coffee shop job was perfect. It was ordinary, predictable, and safe. Sarah turned onto the darker side street that led to her apartment building. She had taken this route 1,000 times before. The streetlights here were old and flickering, casting strange shadows on the wet pavement. She noticed a van parked awkwardly near the intersection, its headlights off. Something felt wrong. Her instincts, buried but never gone, began to whisper warnings in the back of her mind. Before she could react, the van's side door slid open. 3 men rushed out, their faces covered with black masks. Sarah's heart rate remained steady as muscle memory kicked in. She assessed the situation in seconds. 3 attackers, one approaching from each side of her car, one blocking the front. They moved with purpose but lacked professional training. She could tell from their rushed movements and poor positioning. The man on her left yanked her car door open. He was big, over 200 pounds, with rough hands that grabbed her arm. She let herself be pulled from the car, appearing weak and terrified. Her acting was flawless. She screamed and struggled just enough to seem like a helpless victim. The men seemed pleased with themselves, congratulating each other with quick nods. A cloth pressed against her face, strong chemical smell burning her nostrils. Chloroform she recognized instantly. Sarah held her breath and let her body go limp, pretending the drug had worked. Strong arms lifted her and she felt herself being thrown into the back of the van. The door slammed shut and the vehicle lurched forward. Through barely opened eyelids, Sarah studied her captors. The driver was thin and nervous, constantly checking the mirrors. The man in the passenger seat was clearly the leader, older than the others, with a scar running down his neck. The third man, the one who had grabbed her, sat beside her in the back, breathing heavy with excitement. She listened to their conversation, gathering information. They spoke in rushed, excited tones about the ransom they would demand. They mentioned a name, Jennifer Caldwell, daughter of tech billionaire Richard Caldwell. Sarah's mind clicked into place. These idiots had grabbed the wrong woman. They thought she was Jennifer, who apparently drove a similar car and lived in the same neighborhood. The scarred man, whose name she learned was Marcus, was talking on his phone. He demanded $5 million from someone, his voice full of false confidence. There was silence, then confusion in his voice. The person on the other end was clearly telling him something he did not expect. Marcus hung up, his face twisted with anger and confusion. Marcus turned to look at Sarah in the back of the van. Even in the darkness, she could see the worry in his eyes. He grabbed her purse, which they had thrown in beside her, and dumped its contents on the van floor. Her coffee shop ID badge tumbled out, along with her old wallet and keys. No expensive jewelry, no designer items, nothing that suggested wealth. Marcus cursed loudly. The other men started arguing, their voices rising in panic. They had kidnapped the wrong woman. The driver suggested they let her go immediately, just dump her on the side of the road and disappear. But Marcus was not that smart. He was angry, embarrassed, and desperate. He decided they would hold her anyway, maybe demand a smaller ransom from her family, or figure something else out. The van drove for over an hour, leaving the city behind. Sarah counted turns, noted the change in road surface from smooth highway to rough country roads. She memorized every sound, every smell, building a mental map of their location. The training never left her. Even after 3 years of making coffee, her mind still worked like a tactical computer. Finally, The van stopped. Sarah heard the sound of a metal gate opening, then closing behind them. They had arrived at some kind of compound or property. The back door opened and rough hands grabbed her again. She kept her body loose, still playing unconscious. They carried her into a building that smelled of mold and old wood. She was dropped onto a concrete floor. The cold seeped through her coffee shop uniform. She heard footsteps walking away, then a heavy door closing and locking. Sarah waited, counting to 300 in her head, making sure they had truly left her alone. Then her eyes opened fully. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a single barred window near the ceiling. A bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, providing weak, yellow light. In the corner was a dirty mattress and a bucket. This was clearly a prepared space. They had used it before for other victims. Sarah sat up slowly, examining her surroundings with professional precision. The door was heavy steel, locked from outside with what sounded like a deadbolt. The window was too small and too high to be useful for escape. The walls were solid concrete, no weak points. Most people would feel despair in this moment. Sarah felt something entirely different. She felt the old familiar calm that came before a mission. She checked her body for injuries. Nothing serious, just some bruises from being manhandled. Her clothes were intact. They had not searched her properly, a mistake that would cost them dearly. Sewn into the inner seam of her jeans, invisible to casual inspection, was a small, flexible blade. She had carried it every day since leaving the Navy, a habit she could not break. She never thought she would actually need it. Sarah stood and stretched, working the stiffness from her muscles. She began a series of exercises, keeping her body ready. Push-ups, squats, core work. The movement helped her think, helped her plan. She could hear voices outside, muffled but present. She counted at least 4 distinct voices, maybe 5. More people than she had seen in the van hours past. Nobody came to check on her. Through the small window, she watched the sky slowly lighten as dawn approached. She had been captive for nearly 6 hours. Her family would not notice her missing for at least another day. She lived alone, had no close friends in Portland, and was not expected at work until tomorrow evening. The kidnappers had time, but they did not know what they were dealing with. Finally, as morning light filled the small room, she heard footsteps approaching. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Marcus stepped in, followed by another man she had not seen before. This new man was shorter, stocky, with cold eyes that assessed her carefully. He was smarter than the others, she could tell immediately. Marcus grinned at her, false confidence plastered on his face. He thought he was in control. He had no idea that he had brought a predator into his den, not prey. Sarah looked up at them with wide, frightened eyes, playing her role perfectly. Inside, she was already planning their downfall. She just needed to wait for the right moment. These men had made the biggest mistake of their lives when they grabbed her car door. They had awakened something they could not handle. The shorter man spoke, his voice calm and measured. He asked her name, her family, what they did for work. Sarah answered in a shaking voice, giving them true information. She was a barista, lived alone, had a brother in Seattle and parents in Ohio. Nobody with money. The man's face grew darker with each answer. He glanced at Marcus with barely concealed fury. Marcus tried to salvage the situation, suggesting they could still get something from her family, maybe $50,000. The shorter man shook his head. This was a disaster, he said. They needed to decide what to do with her. The implications hung in the air, heavy and threatening. Sarah heard what they did not say. They could not let her go. She had seen their faces, could identify them. They were discussing whether to kill her. Sarah let fear show on her face, but inside she remained ice cold. She had faced death many times before, in dusty compounds in Afghanistan, in the dark waters off the coast of Somalia, and a dozen other places she could never discuss. These amateur criminals did not scare her. They just made her angry. She had left military life for peace, and they had dragged her back into violence. Now they would pay the price for that mistake. The 2 men left the room, their voices fading as they argued in the hallway. Sarah listened carefully. She counted 5 different voices now, Definitely 5 men in total. She heard fragments of their conversation through the walls. The shorter man, whose name was Vincent, was furious with Marcus for the botched kidnapping. They had been planning to grab Jennifer Caldwell for months, watching her routines, learning her schedule. One moment of carelessness, one case of mistaken identity, and their entire plan had collapsed. Vincent wanted to cut their losses. His voice was cold and practical. They should dispose of her and disappear before police started investigating. Marcus argued back, his pride wounded. Maybe they could use her differently, he suggested. Ransom was not the only way to make money from a captive woman. Sarah's jaw tightened as she understood his implication. That sealed his fate in her mind. She spent the next hour examining every inch of her cell, looking for anything useful. The mattress was old, its springs visible through torn fabric. She carefully extracted 2 metal springs, each about 6 inches long. With patience and pressure, she bent one into a hook shape. The other she kept straight, filing the end against the concrete floor until it became reasonably sharp. These would be her tools. The light bulb above her head was her next focus. She dragged the mattress under it and stood carefully, reaching up. The bulb was hot, but not unbearable. She unscrewed it slowly until the room went dark, then screwed it back just enough to maintain contact. Now she could control the light with a simple twist. Darkness would be her advantage when the time came. Sarah returned to the floor and began her mental preparation. She reviewed everything she knew about close-quarters combat, about fighting multiple opponents, about using surprise and speed to overcome superior numbers. The training came back like she had never left the teams. Her breathing slowed, her mind sharpened. She was no longer Sarah the barista. She was Lieutenant Mitchell again, and these men were enemy combatants. Around noon, the door opened again. A young man entered, probably early 20s, carrying a paper plate with a sandwich and a bottle of water. He was the nervous one from the van, the driver. His eyes would not meet hers. He set the food down quickly and turned to leave. Sarah made her voice small and frightened, exactly what he would expect to hear. She asked if she could use a bathroom. The young man hesitated, clearly not sure what to do. He called out to someone, and Marcus appeared in the doorway. Marcus looked at her with disgust and gestured down the hall. The young man pulled her up roughly and pushed her forward. She stumbled, still playing weak and scared. The bathroom was small and filthy, but it had a mirror. As Sarah washed her hands, she studied the reflection of the door behind her. The young man stood guard outside, shifting nervously. She could hear voices from another room, the others watching television or playing cards. She was learning the layout of the building, understanding their routines. Information was her weapon right now. Back in the cell, Sarah ate the sandwich slowly, maintaining her energy. She needed her strength for what was coming. She drank half the water and saved the rest. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. She exercised again, keeping her movements quiet. She practiced strikes and blocks in slow motion, visualizing her opponents, planning her moves. As evening approached, she heard increased activity outside. Voices grew louder, more agitated. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. They were arguing about money. Apparently, they had lost a significant amount on a failed deal, and the botched kidnapping had made everything worse. Vincent was demanding they make a decision about her tonight. Either ransom her to her family, or make her disappear permanently. Marcus insisted her family would pay something. $20,000, maybe $30,000. Enough to help their situation. Vincent reluctantly agreed to try, but gave a deadline. If the family did not agree by midnight, they would end this. Sarah checked the small window. The sun was setting. She had perhaps 6 hours left, if things went badly. Around 8 in the evening, they came for her again. This time, it was Marcus and Vincent together, with the big man from the van following behind. They brought a phone and a script. They were going to make her call her family. Marcus held the phone while Vincent held a knife. Making sure she understood the stakes, Sarah took the phone with trembling hands. She dialed her brother's number in Seattle, knowing he would answer. Tom picked up on the third ring. Sarah launched into the scripted plea, begging for help, saying she had been kidnapped and they wanted $20,000. Her voice shook with fear, exactly as expected. But as she spoke, she added something extra. Small details that seemed like panic but were actually information. She mentioned the smell of pine trees and the sound of trains in the distance. She said she was cold because the building had concrete floors and metal walls. She was terrified they would hurt her before sunrise. Each detail was a clue for investigators. Breadcrumbs that might help find this location. Tom's voice exploded through the phone, confused and angry. He demanded to speak to the kidnappers, asking if this was a joke. Vincent grabbed the phone and made the demands clear. $20,000 delivered by midnight, or they would never see Sarah again. Tom said he needed time, needed to gather the money, needed to think. Vincent gave him 3 hours and hung up. The 3 men left, satisfied with themselves. Sarah sat back down on the mattress, her mind racing. Tom would call the police immediately. She knew her brother. He would not just gather money, he would get help. But help might not arrive in time. She needed to be ready to save herself. She waited another hour, letting the building settle into its evening routine. She heard a television playing, the men laughing at something. She smelled food cooking, probably their dinner. They were relaxed now, thinking the situation was under control. That was good. Relaxed people made mistakes. Sarah retrieved her improvised tools from where she had hidden them under the mattress. The flexible blade from her jeans, the sharpened spring, and the hooked spring. She also had the half-full water bottle. Not much, but she had worked with less in the field. She positioned herself near the door, in the blind spot where someone entering would not immediately see her. She waited in a half-crouch, breathing slowly, listening to every sound. Around 10 o'clock, she heard footsteps approaching. The lock turned. The door began to open. It was the young, nervous driver again, coming to check on her. He was alone, a critical mistake. As the door swung open and he stepped inside, Sarah moved. She had spent 3 years making coffee, but her body remembered 8 years of combat training. She struck the side of his knee with devastating force, a targeted kick that buckled his leg instantly. As he fell forward, she caught his head and slammed it into the concrete wall, controlling the impact to knock him unconscious, but not kill him. He crumpled to the floor without making a sound. Sarah caught the heavy door before it could swing shut and lock her in again. She dragged the unconscious man fully into the room and quickly searched him. He had a phone in his pocket, but no weapons. She took the phone and slipped out into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. The hallway was dimly lit and narrow, with rooms on either side. She could hear the television more clearly now, coming from a room at the end of the hall. She moved silently, her feet remembering how to walk without sound. She found a bathroom and stepped inside, locking the door. She pulled out the phone and quickly sent her location to Tom, using the phone's GPS coordinates. Then she sent the same information to 911 with a brief message about being kidnapped. She turned off the phone and tucked it into her waistband. Now help would come. But she still needed to survive until it arrived. Sarah splashed water on her face and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection stared back, and for the first time in 3 years, she saw the seal looking back at her. The barista was gone. Lieutenant Mitchell had returned. She opened the bathroom door slowly and continued her reconnaissance. She found a kitchen area, empty, but with knives on the counter. She selected a medium-sized blade with a good grip. Now she was properly armed. She moved through the building like a ghost, mapping it in her mind. This was an old warehouse converted into some kind of illegal operations center. Besides the room where they held her, there were 3 other rooms that looked like cells. They had done this before, multiple times. The thought made her cold fury burn hotter. These men were not just criminals. They were predators who had hurt others. She found evidence in one room, items that had clearly belonged to previous victims. Jewelry, phones, identification cards. Her mission had just expanded. She was not just escaping anymore. She was going to make sure these men never hurt anyone else again. The television room was at the front of the building. Through a crack in the door, she could see Marcus, Vincent, and the big man sitting on old couches watching a football game. They were drinking beer, completely unaware that their captive was free and moving through their facility. She counted weapons. Marcus had a pistol on the coffee table. The big man had nothing visible. Vincent had another gun tucked into his waistband. Sarah did the math. 3 men in this room, 1 unconscious in the cell. That meant 1 more somewhere in the building. She needed to find him before making her move. She retreated silently, continuing her search. In a back office area, she found the 5th man. He was older, working on a laptop, his back to the door, counting maybe, or planning. He wore reading glasses and looked completely non-threatening. She could take them. 1 at a time, or all at once. She had the training and the element of surprise. But she had to be smart. The 2 with guns were the priority targets. She needed to neutralize them first before they could fire and potentially hit her or call for backup. Sarah positioned herself in the shadows of the hallway and began to formulate her attack plan. She heard a phone ringing in the television room. Marcus answered it, and his voice rose in anger. It was Tom calling back. Sarah's brother was stalling, asking questions, trying to negotiate. Good, that would keep them distracted. She used the noise to move closer to the office where the 5th man worked. He was the easiest target, isolated and unaware. Sarah stepped into the office silently. The man never heard her coming. She applied a chokehold from behind with practiced efficiency, cutting off blood flow to his brain. He struggled for a few seconds, then went limp. She lowered him to the floor gently and used his belt to tie his hands behind his back. 1 down for to go. But as she turned to leave the office, she heard a voice behind her. The young driver had woken up faster than expected, stood in the hallway, his face bloody and confused, but his hand reaching for his pocket. He was going to shout, going to warn the others. Sarah's window of surprise was closing rapidly. Sarah closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. The young man's hand was still reaching for his pocket when she struck him in the solar plexus with a precise punch that knocked all the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping silently like a fish on land. Before he could recover, she swept his legs and controlled his fall to prevent noise. She pressed a knee into his back and used strips torn from his shirt to bind his hands and gag his mouth. 2 down, 3 to go. The element of complete surprise was compromised. She needed to move faster now, before someone noticed the missing men. Sarah dragged the young driver into the office with the older man and closed the door. She wedged a chair under the handle to keep them contained. Back in the hallway, she reassessed her situation. 3 men remained in the television room, 2 of them armed. The smart play would be to wait for police, hide until help arrived. But Sarah knew that could take 30 minutes or more, and these men would likely check on her soon. When they found her missing and their accomplices tied up, things would get violent fast. They might run, taking their weapons and experience with them. Other people could get hurt. No, this ended tonight, and it ended here. Sarah moved through the warehouse until she found the electrical panel. She studied it briefly, identifying the breakers for different sections of the building. She left it for now, but marked its location in her mind. Darkness might be her ally soon. She returned to a position near the television room, listening to their conversation. Marcus was pacing now, checking his watch constantly. The deadline for the ransom was approaching. Vincent was calmer, but growing suspicious. He called out for the young driver, asking him to check on the prisoner. There was no answer. Vincent called again, his voice sharper. Still nothing. Vincent stood up, his hand moving to the gun in his waistband. He told Marcus and the big man to stay put while he checked things out. This was Sarah's chance. If she could take Vincent quietly, the odds would shift dramatically in her favor. She positioned herself in the dark hallway, pressed against the wall. Vincent emerged from the television room. Gun drawn now, his instincts telling him something was wrong. He moved cautiously, checking the bathroom first, then heading toward the cell where Sarah had been held. As he passed her position, Sarah struck from behind. She grabbed his gun hand and twisted hard, applying a joint lock that forced him to drop the weapon. At the same time, she kicked the back of his knee and drove him face first into the wall. But Vincent was tougher and more experienced than the others. Despite the pain, he spun and threw an elbow that caught Sarah on the shoulder. She absorbed the blow and countered with a knee strike to his ribs. They grappled in the narrow hallway, both fighting for control. Vincent was strong and well-trained in street fighting, but Sarah had military precision and years of practicing against larger opponents. She hooked his leg and took him to the ground, immediately moving to a dominant position. Her forearm pressed against his throat, cutting off his air supply. Vincent's eyes went wide as he realized what was happening. He had grabbed the wrong woman indeed. This was no terrified barista. This was a trained killer who could end him in seconds. Sarah held the pressure until Vincent's struggles weakened, then stopped. She did not kill him, though part of her wanted to, after what she had heard them planning. Instead, she rendered him unconscious and used his own belt and shoelaces to bind him thoroughly. She took his gun, checked the magazine, and made sure a round was chambered. Now she was properly armed, but the fight had made noise. She heard chairs scraping in the television room, voices raised in alarm. Marcus called out Vincent's name, demanding to know what was happening. Sarah heard footsteps approaching, heavy and fast. The big man was coming to investigate, with Marcus likely close behind. She made a split-second decision. Instead of hiding, she moved toward them, using their own momentum against their awareness. As the big man rounded the corner, he saw what looked like a frightened woman backing away. His brain took a moment to process the contradiction between what he expected and what he saw. That moment was all Sarah needed. She feinted left, and when he shifted his weight to follow, she swept his front leg while pushing his chest. Physics did the rest. The big man fell hard, his head hitting the concrete floor with a solid thunk. He groaned and tried to rise, but Sarah delivered a precise strike to a nerve cluster in his neck. Eyes rolled back and he went still. Marcus appeared in the hallway, his pistol raised, his face twisted with rage and confusion. He fired, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet went wide, passing inches from Sarah's head and sparking off the concrete wall. Marcus was panicking, his hands shaking, his aim terrible. Sarah did not hesitate. She returned fire. With Vincent's gun, aiming for center mass as she had been trained, the bullet hit Marcus in the shoulder, spinning him around and making him drop his weapon. He screamed in pain and collapsed against the wall, clutching his wounded shoulder. Sarah kicked his gun away and stood over him, her weapon trained on his chest. Marcus looked up at her through tears of pain, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. He had not kidnapped a helpless woman. He had brought a warrior into his hideout and given her every reason to destroy him. She secured Marcus with the belt from the big man, making sure the bonds were tight despite his wounded shoulder. She checked his injury. The bullet had gone through cleanly, missing the bone and major arteries. He would survive to face justice. Sarah felt no guilt about shooting him. He had been pointing a gun at her, had fired first, had planned to harm her. This was textbook self-defense. All 5 men were now neutralized. Sarah quickly moved through the building, checking each one to make sure they were secure. She collected all the phones and weapons she could find, creating a pile in the television room. She found evidence of their crimes scattered throughout the warehouse. Laptops with files, documents about previous kidnappings, lists of targets. This was a professional operation that had been running for years. Sarah sat down on one of the couches, Vincent's gun still in her hand, and waited. She could hear sirens in the distance now, growing louder. Tom and the police were coming. She thought about calling them, but decided to wait. Let them find her here, surrounded by 5 bound criminals, the evidence of their crimes laid out clearly. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving her shaky and tired. She had not felt this way in 3 years. The rush of combat, the clarity of life or death decisions, the satisfaction of victory. Part of her had missed it, though she hated to admit that. She had thought she could leave this life behind, become normal, forget her training. But it had been inside her all along, waiting for the moment when it was needed. Red and blue lights flashed through the dirty windows. Car doors slammed, voices shouted commands. The police were setting up a perimeter, not yet knowing what they would find inside. Sarah stood and moved to the door, making sure they could see her clearly through the window. She set Vincent's gun on the floor and raised her hands, not wanting any trigger-happy officers to make assumptions. A voice boomed through a bullhorn, ordering whoever was inside to come out with hands up. Sarah opened the door slowly and stepped into the light, her hands clearly visible. She identified herself calmly, told them she was the kidnapping victim, and that the suspects were inside, secured, and no longer a threat. Officers rushed forward, some surrounding her, others flooding into the building. Sarah answered their rapid-fire questions patiently. Yes, she was injured, but nothing serious. No, there were no other hostages. Yes, all 5 suspects were inside, tied up and accounted for. Yes, she had secured them herself. No, she was not law enforcement, just someone with relevant training. A senior detective arrived, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that took in every detail. She looked at Sarah, then at the warehouse, then back at Sarah. She asked the question everyone was thinking. What kind of barista takes down 5 armed kidnappers single-handedly? Sarah smiled slightly, the first real smile since this whole nightmare began. She told the detective her full name and suggested they run a background check. They would find her military service records, though much of it would be classified. She had been part of special operations, trained for exactly these kinds of situations. The kidnappers had grabbed the wrong woman indeed. Tom arrived moments later, his car screeching to a halt behind the police vehicles. He pushed through the perimeter, shouting Sarah's name. When he saw her standing there, alive and unharmed, he grabbed her in a tight hug. She hugged him back, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours finally settling on her shoulders. Tom pulled back and looked at her face, seeing something different there. She was not the same sister who had been serving coffee yesterday. The soft edges were gone, replaced by the hard certainty of someone who had just been through combat. He asked if she was okay, and she nodded. She would be eventually. Paramedics checked her over despite her protests. Minor bruises, some scrapes, nothing requiring hospitalization. They checked the 5 criminals too. The young driver had a concussion. Vincent had bruising around his throat. The big man was still unconscious but stable. The older man in the office was physically fine, but psychologically shaken. Marcus was the worst off with his gunshot wound. But even he would make a full recovery before spending a very long time in prison. The detective returned with a laptop, having pulled up Sarah's records. Her expression had changed from skeptical to impressed to slightly intimidated. She asked if Sarah would be willing to give a full statement. Sarah agreed, but requested they do it somewhere warm with decent coffee. After everything, she really wanted a good cup of coffee, not the terrible stuff the kidnappers had given her. At the police station, Sarah spent 3 hours giving a detailed account of everything that had happened. The kidnapping, the captivity, her escape, and the neutralization of the suspects. She included every detail she could remember about their conversations, their plans, their previous victims. The detectives took notes furiously, realizing this testimony would help close multiple missing persons cases. She also provided them with all the physical evidence she had observed in the warehouse. The items belonging to previous victims, the files on the computers, the lists of potential targets. This criminal organization had been operating for at least 5 years, responsible for at least a dozen kidnappings across 3 states. Tonight's operation would not just save Sarah's life, but potentially bring justice for many other victims and their families. As dawn broke through the windows of the police station, Sarah finally finished her statement. The lead detective thanked her, calling her a hero. Sarah shook her head. She was not a hero, just someone who had the training and the situation forced her to use it. Heroes sought out danger to help others. She had just been trying to get home from work. Tom drove her back to her apartment as the sun rose over Portland. The city was waking up, people starting their normal days, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the night. Sarah looked out the window, exhausted but unable to sleep. Everything looked different now. The streets she walked every day, the coffee shop where she worked, her quiet apartment, all of it felt like a costume she had been wearing, and last night had torn it away. Her phone, recovered by police from the kidnappers, buzzed constantly with messages. News had spread somehow, and people were calling and texting. Her manager from the coffee shop, concerned about her well-being. Old military friends who had seen her name in classified reports and wanted to check in. Even a few reporters who had somehow gotten her number. Sarah turned off the phone and leaned back in the seat. Tom glanced at her, worry clear on his face. He asked what she was thinking about. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said she was thinking about change, about pretending to be something she was not, about the fact that 3 years of making lattes had not changed who she really was underneath. Tom did not push for more explanation. He just drove, letting his sister process everything in her own time. When they arrived at her apartment building, he offered to stay with her, but Sarah declined. She needed to be alone, to think, to figure out what came next. She hugged him goodbye and promised to call later that day. Inside her apartment, everything was exactly as she had left it the previous morning. The breakfast dishes still in the sink, the book she had been reading open on the coffee table, her work uniform from 2 days ago hanging on the bedroom door. But Sarah felt like a different person walking through these familiar spaces. The woman who had left for her coffee shop shift yesterday morning felt like a stranger now. She showered for a long time, letting the hot water wash away more than just the physical grime of captivity. She kept replaying the events in her mind, analyzing her decisions, considering what she could have done differently. It was an old habit from her military days, the after-action review that followed every mission. Some habits never died, no matter how much you tried to bury them. When she finally emerged from the shower, Sarah found her old Navy footlocker in the back of her closet. She had not opened it in 3 years, had tried to forget it even existed. But now she knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside were pieces of her old life, medals she had earned but never displayed. Photographs of her team, most of them still serving, a few who had not made it home. Letters of commendation from commanding officers. The trident pin that marked her as a SEAL. One of only a handful of women to earn it. At the bottom of the footlocker was a leather journal. Sarah had kept it during her last deployment, writing down her thoughts and feelings when the weight of everything became too heavy. She flipped through the pages now, reading her younger self's words. The excitement of missions accomplished. The grief of teammates lost. The growing weariness with violence and death. The final entry was short. I need to find out who I am when I'm not at war. Sarah set the journal aside and stared at the contents of the footlocker. She had spent 3 years trying to answer that question. She had tried to be ordinary, normal, just another person working a regular job and living a quiet life. But last night had proven something she had suspected all along. The skills, the training, the person she had become during those 8 years of service, none of it had gone away. It had just been dormant, waiting. Her phone rang, breaking her contemplation. It was a number she did not recognize, but the area code was Virginia, Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters. Her heart rate picked up slightly as she answered. A familiar voice greeted her, Captain Rebecca Torres, who had been her last commanding officer before retirement, Captain. Torres had heard about the kidnapping and Sarah's actions through official channels. The FBI had flagged it because of Sarah's background, and word traveled fast in the special operations community. Torres asked how she was doing, and Sarah gave an honest answer. Physically fine, mentally processing, emotionally uncertain about everything. There was a pause on the line. Then Torres asked if Sarah had given any thought to coming back. The Navy always had a place for someone with her skills and experience. They were expanding training programs, needed experienced operators to teach the next generation. Or if she wanted to return to active operations, there were positions available. The choice would be entirely hers. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. 3 years ago, she would have said no immediately. She had been so certain that she needed to leave that life behind. But now, after last night, she was not so sure anymore. She had felt alive during those hours, had felt purposeful in a way that making coffee had never provided. But she had also felt the old darkness creeping back. The part of her that could hurt people efficiently and without hesitation. She told Torres she needed time to think about it. Torres understood, gave Sarah her direct number, and said the offer would remain open. After they hung up, Sarah sat on her couch and stared out the window at the Portland morning. People walked by on the sidewalk below, heading to work or school or wherever their normal lives took them. She had wanted so badly to be one of them. Over the next few days, life became increasingly complicated. The story of the kidnapping and her dramatic response hit the news. Despite her requests for privacy, reporters camped outside her apartment building. The coffee shop where she worked became a tourist attraction, with people coming in just to see where the Navy SEAL barista had worked. Her manager, well-meaning but overwhelmed, suggested she take some time off until the attention died down. Sarah found herself trapped in her apartment, unable to live the quiet, anonymous life she had built. Every time she left the building, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Did she feel like a hero? Would she write a book? Was she going back to the military? The attention was suffocating, and worse, it felt wrong. She had not done anything special, just used her training to survive a terrible situation. The FBI and local police continued to investigate the kidnapping ring. Sarah was called back several times to provide additional details and identify items recovered from the warehouse. Each visit to the police station was followed by more media attention, more questions she did not want to answer. The detective in charge apologized for the circus, but explained that the case was high profile because of the multiple victims they were now identifying. The 5 men she had captured were facing dozens of charges. Marcus and Vincent were the ringleaders, but all 5 were equally complicit. The evidence Sarah had helped preserve was making the prosecutor's case straightforward. The young nervous driver tried to make a deal, offering testimony in exchange for a lighter sentence. The others stayed silent on advice of their lawyers, but it hardly mattered. The evidence was overwhelming. A week after the incident, Sarah received a visitor at her apartment. A woman in her 30s knocked on her door, introduced herself as Amy Chen, and asked if she could talk for a few minutes. Sarah almost said no, assuming she was another reporter, but something in Amy's eyes made her hesitate. There was pain there, old and deep. Amy explained that she had been kidnapped by the same group 4 years ago. They had held her for 3 days before her family paid the ransom. She had survived physically, but carried psychological scars that had never fully healed. When she heard about Sarah taking down the men who had hurt her, about the police recovering evidence of multiple victims, she had felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that they were finally caught. Anger at how long they had operated. And gratitude towards Sarah for stopping them. Sarah listened quietly as Amy talked about her experience, about the nightmares that still woke her up, about the therapy that had helped but not cured her. Amy said she was not the only former victim who wanted to meet Sarah. There were at least 8 others they had identified so far, and more cases were still being connected. Some wanted to say thank you. Others just wanted to meet the woman who had done what they had not been able to do, fight back. For the first time since the incident, Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes. She had been so focused on her own complicated feelings about what happened that she had not fully considered the other victims. These people whose lives had been torn apart by the same men who had grabbed her. She had given them something they desperately needed: justice and closure. That meant something even if she was uncomfortable being called a hero. Sarah agreed to meet with the other survivors, and over the following weeks, she heard their stories. Each one was heartbreaking in different ways. A college student who had been held for a week, who had dropped out of school afterward and still struggled to leave her house. A businessman who paid the ransom but was never quite the same, whose marriage had fallen apart under the strain. A mother who had been taken while her children were at school, who still had panic attacks whenever she dropped them off. These meetings changed something in Sarah. She began to understand that her actions that night had ripples far beyond her own survival. She had stopped predators who had caused immeasurable harm. She had brought evidence that would close cases and bring peace to families. She had proven that victims were not helpless, that training and preparation could make a difference. It was not about being a hero. It was about being capable when capability was needed. The coffee shop eventually called and asked if she wanted to return to work, but Sarah knew that chapter of her life was over. She could not go back to pretending to be someone she was not. The question was, what came next? Did she return to military service? Did she find another way to use her skills? Did she try something completely different? Sarah received other offers beyond the Navy. Private security firms wanted her expertise. Self-defense instructors wanted her to teach classes. A publishing company offered a substantial advance for a book about her experience. Each option represented a different path, a different version of who she could become. She spent long hours thinking, walking through Portland's parks and streets, trying to find clarity. One evening, she ended up at the waterfront, watching the river flow past as the sun set. She thought about the journal entry from 3 years ago, her younger self trying to figure out who she was without war. She realized now that she had been asking the wrong question. It was not about being someone without her military training. That was part of her, woven into who she was at a fundamental level. The real question was how to use those skills in a way that aligned with her values, that helped people without consuming her soul the way combat operations had. She did not need to run from what she was capable of. She needed to direct it toward something meaningful. Sarah made her decision over the next few days. She would not return to active military service. She had been right 3 years ago that she needed a different path. But she would not hide her capabilities either. She would use them, just in a different context. She contacted a nonprofit organization that provided security training to journalists and aid workers operating in dangerous regions. They needed instructors with real-world experience who could teach people how to survive kidnappings, hostile situations, and dangerous environments. It was perfect for Sarah. She could use her SEAL training to help people who were trying to make the world better. People who reported on conflicts or provided humanitarian aid. She would not be engaging in combat herself, but she would be preparing others to survive when they found themselves in harm's way. It felt right in a way nothing else had since her retirement. The organization was thrilled to have her. They brought her on as a senior instructor and curriculum developer. Sarah threw herself into the work, designing training programs based on her own experience and the tactics she had used during her captivity. She taught people how to remain calm under pressure, how to read their captors, how to look for opportunities to escape, how to survive until help arrived. Her first class included 8 aid workers heading to conflict zones in the Middle East and Africa. Sarah taught them everything she could in 2 intensive weeks. Situational awareness, basic self-defense, psychological techniques for maintaining hope during captivity, improvised tools and weapons, negotiation tactics. She pushed them hard, but with compassion, knowing that this training might literally save their lives someday. The students were initially intimidated by her background and by the intense reputation she had gained from the kidnapping incident. But Sarah was patient and encouraging, breaking down complex techniques into manageable skills. She shared her own story, including the moments of fear and uncertainty, showing them that even trained professionals felt scared. The key was not eliminating fear, but functioning despite it. Months passed, and Sarah found a new rhythm to her life. She taught classes several times a year, developed training materials, consulted with organizations on security protocols. Between classes, she volunteered at a local self-defense nonprofit, teaching free classes to women and vulnerable populations. The media attention gradually faded as news stories captured public interest. She kept in touch with the other kidnapping survivors, forming a sort of unofficial support group. They met monthly, sharing their healing journeys and supporting each other through the difficult moments. Several of them had started advocacy work, pushing for stronger laws against human trafficking and kidnapping. Sarah contributed where she could, testifying at legislative hearings about the realities of captivity and the importance of victim support services. Marcus, Vincent, and the other members of the kidnapping ring were all convicted and received lengthy prison sentences. Marcus got 40 years, Vincent 35, and the others between 15 and 25 years each. The young nervous driver, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received 12 years. Justice had been served, though Sarah felt no particular satisfaction from it. The men would be in prison. That was what mattered. A year after the kidnapping, Sarah returned to the warehouse where it had all happened. The building was scheduled for demolition, and she wanted to see it one last time. She walked through the empty rooms, remembering that night with strange clarity. This was where she had been held. This was where she had fought. This was where she had reclaimed herself. Standing in the cell where they had imprisoned her, Sarah thought about the journey of the past year. She had found a way to integrate all the parts of herself. The warrior and the person seeking peace, the skills honed in combat, and the desire to help others. She was not hiding anymore, not pretending to be something she was not. She was fully herself, using her capabilities for good, without letting them consume her. As she left the warehouse for the last time, Sarah felt a sense of peace she had not experienced in years. The demolition crew arrived, ready to tear down the building. Sarah watched for a moment as the first walls fell. The place that had held so much darkness was being erased, making way for something new. It felt symbolic. Sarah walked back to her car, her phone buzzing with a message. It was from one of her students, an aid worker now in Syria. He wanted to thank her. His convoy had been stopped by armed men 2 days ago, and he had used the techniques she taught to de-escalate the situation and protect his team. Everyone had survived because of what she had taught them. He called her a hero, and this time Sarah did not reject the label. Maybe she was a hero, not because of what she had done to her kidnappers, but because of what she was doing now. Teaching others to survive. Helping victims heal. Using her dark experiences to bring light to others. The Navy SEAL training had given her skills. The kidnapping had reminded her she had those skills. But this work, teaching and helping others, this was giving her purpose. Sarah drove home through Portland, the city that had witnessed her transformation from warrior to barista to something new entirely. She thought about the person she had been when she first moved here 3 years ago, desperate to leave violence behind. That woman had been running from herself. The woman driving through the city now was not running anymore. She had found her place, her purpose, her answer to the question in her journal. Who was she when she was not at war? She was someone who prepared others for war, who helped victims become survivors, who turned her painful capabilities into protective purpose. She was Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL, former barista, current teacher, and advocate. She was all of those things at once, no longer divided, finally whole. The kidnappers had grabbed the wrong woman that rainy night, but in doing so, they had helped her find the right path. And for that, in a strange way, she was almost grateful.